The air in the Redemption Saloon was a thick, stagnant soup of sweat-stale whiskey and desperation. Lamplight yellowed and greasy from the cigar smoke that coiled toward the ceiling like damned souls cast long dancing shadows on the grimy walls. At a table in the corner, away from the boisterous laughter and the tinny plinking of the out-of-tune piano, a different kind of silence reigned. It was a predatory quiet circling the five men hunched over a felt table scarred with burns and stains. Caleb Blackwood stared at the 5 cards in his hand, but he didn't see them. He saw the face of his late wife, Martha, her smile as bright and fleeting as a prairie sunrise. He saw his daughter Lily, her eyes wide, and haunted her voice a ghost in a house that had become a tomb. 2 years. 2 years of dust settling not just on the furniture, but on his very soul. He had come to Redemption not to win, but to lose. To feel the sting of one final definitive loss that might cauterize the gaping wound inside him. The chips were gone. The cash was gone. His horse was gone. All that remained of the life he once knew was a small, cool weight in his vest pocket. "Well, Blackwood." Elias Finch's voice was a smooth-oiled rasp that slid under a man's skin. "The pot's to you. The game's waiting." Finch was a man carved from shadow and ambition. His tailored suit was a stark black anomaly in the dusty town, his face pale and narrow, dominated by eyes as cold and gray as river stones. He owned the bank half the businesses and the fear of every man in that room. He had been bleeding Caleb dry all night, not with the luck of the draw, but with a patient surgical cruelty. Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he reached into his vest. His fingers closed around the object, its familiar edges a painful comfort. He drew it out and placed it in the center of the table. A silver locket tarnished with age, but intricately carved with forget-me-nots. It lay on the stained green felt, catching the lamplight, a beacon of memory in a den of oblivion. "It was my wife's." Caleb's voice was gravel. "It's all I have left." A ripple of unease went through the other players. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a desecration. Men gambled away their futures, their land, their pride. They did not gamble away their dead. Finch's cold eyes fixed on the locket. For a single, imperceptible moment, his smooth facade cracked. A flicker of something primal recognition mingled with a deep and venomous hatred flashed across his features before being instantly suppressed. It was a tremor so slight that only a man looking for it would have seen it. Caleb, lost in his own fog of grief, saw nothing. "A sentimental piece," Finch drawled, recovering his composure. He leaned back a predator, enjoying the final moments before the kill. "But I'm a businessman, Blackwood, not a pawnbroker. Its value is insufficient. It's all I have." Caleb repeated, his gaze locked on the silver heart on the table. Finch smiled, a thin, bloodless slash in his pale face. He looked past Caleb toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. "Perhaps," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper, "we can make the pot more interesting." He raised his voice. "Agnes, get out here." The kitchen doors swung open, and a woman emerged, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She was tall and broad-shouldered, a sturdily built woman, whose plain dark dress did little to conceal her size. Her face was impassive, her eyes the color of a twilight sky just before the stars appear. She moved with a slow, deliberate weight, her presence a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the saloon. The men at the bar fell silent, their jeers dying in their throats. "My indentured cook," Finch announced with theatrical flourish. "Bought her contract off a broke farmer, strong back, quiet as a mouse, but eats more than a horse and is about as pleasant to look at. He waved a dismissive hand at her. I lack the cash to call your trinket, so I'll offer you a trade. I'll stake her contract against your locket. The room plunged into a shocked silence. Even for redemption, a town that had long ago traded its soul for Finch's coin, this was a new low. A man did not bet a human being. The woman Agnes did not flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the smoky room, as if this humiliation were just one more stone on a long, hard road. The disgust in the room was a palpable thing. It coiled in Caleb's stomach, hot and acidic. He should have stood up, thrown the table over, and walked away. He should have defended the woman's dignity. But the sight of the locket, Martha's locket, in the pot next to this terrible wager paralyzed him. He could not leave it there. He was trapped. Caleb heard himself say the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He laid down his cards. A full house, aces over eights. The dead man's hand, they called it. A grim smile touched his lips. It was fitting. Finch's eyes narrowed. He slowly revealed his own hand. 3 queens. For a heartbeat, the saloon was utterly still. Then one of the other players let out a low whistle. Caleb had won. He reached out and swept the locket back into his palm, its cool metal a familiar comfort. But as he looked up, he saw the woman Agnes still standing by the kitchen door. The prize. He had saved his past, but in doing so, he had become responsible for a stranger's future. The weight of her stare was heavier than any stack of gold coins. He had walked into the saloon to lose everything, and in a way, he had succeeded. The journey back to the ranch was a long, silent procession under a sky bleached pale by the relentless sun. The sun bled across the horizon, setting fire to the clouds and casting long skeletal shadows from the saguaro. Caleb rode ahead, the locket a cold weight in his pocket. The woman a silent accusation in the buckboard wagon rattling behind him. He could feel her eyes on his back, a steady, unnerving pressure. He had won. He had lost everything. The thought circled in his mind like a vulture. He had wanted an ending, a finality. Instead, he had been handed a beginning he did not want and did not understand. He glanced back. Agnes sat bolt upright on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't looking at him, but at the landscape unfolding around them, a brutal, beautiful expanse of cracked earth, hardy creosote, and distant, heat-shimmered mesas. There was no fear in her posture, only a profound and weary stillness. His mind drifted to redemption. He remembered it as a boy, a bustling stop on the cattle trail where laughter spilled from the saloon, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer was a promise of industry and progress. Now Finch's shadow lay over everything. Storefronts were boarded up, their owners bought out or run out by Finch's predatory loans. The sheriff, an old tired man named Brody, walked his beat with his eyes fixed on the ground, a lawman who had long ago decided that survival was a more practical virtue than justice. Caleb had known Brody his whole life, had seen him face down outlaws without flinching. Now he wouldn't even meet Finch's gaze. Eleanor, who ran the general store, was one of the few who held out. She had been Martha's closest friend, a sharp, kind woman, with a will as tough as cured leather. She had watched Caleb's slow decay with worried eyes, pressing jars of preserves and sacks of flour on him that she knew he couldn't pay for. Martha wouldn't want to see you like this, Caleb, she'd said just last month. She wouldn't want to see you let this place, her place, turn to dust. He was proving her right. As they crested the last rise, his ranch came into view, and shame washed over him. It wasn't a home. It was a monument to his neglect, The porch sagged like a tired old man's shoulders. Weeds choked what was once Martha's vibrant flower garden. The whitewash on the house was peeling, leaving the wood beneath exposed and vulnerable like a wound. And there, on the small hill overlooking it all, was the grave. A simple wooden cross tilted by the wind standing guard over a mound of earth slowly being reclaimed by the wild grass. The sight of it was a physical blow, a daily reminder of his failure. This was the landscape of his grief, and he had just brought a stranger into the heart of it. He reined in his horse before the skeletal frame of the house and dismounted. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. Agnes did not wait for him. She climbed down from the buckboard with a slow, deliberate grace, her feet landing on the parched earth with a soft finality. Her gaze swept over the dilapidated house, the untended yard, and came to rest on the solitary grave on the hill. Caleb strode toward her, the silence between them, a living thing, thick and uncomfortable. He needed to set the terms to establish that this was a transaction, nothing more. His voice, when it came, was rust. "The room's in the back." He grunted, gesturing vaguely toward the house. "You work, you eat. That's the deal." He expected a nod or perhaps a question. He did not expect her to turn and face him directly, her twilight eyes meeting his with an unsettling, knowing calm. For the first time, he felt truly seen by her, and the sensation was like a splash of cold water. She looked from his face to the grave on the hill, and then back again. Her voice was low, a current beneath a frozen river, carrying a weight that defied the simple words she spoke. "You think this was about a card game, Mr. Blackwood?" She said, her gaze unwavering. "You are mistaken." A cold tremor, sharp and unwelcome, ran down Caleb's spine. "He let you win." She continued, her voice as certain as the setting sun. "He will come for this land, for this house, for everything you have left. He wants to see it all turn to ash." The words hung in the dry air, not a guess, not a warning, but a prophecy. It was the inciting incident. He hadn't known he was waiting for a spark in the tinder of his desolate life. The numbness of his grief was pierced by a new and terrifying clarity. Finch hadn't lost a cook. He had deployed a scout. This quiet, discarded woman was the first volley in a war Caleb hadn't even known was declared. He had brought home a reckoning, and it had just spoken its name. He showed her the room without another word. It was little more than a closet off the kitchen, furnished with a narrow cot and a single crate for a table. A film of dust covered everything, a fine gray powder that tasted of abandonment. He left her there, closing the door on her silence, and retreated to the cold comfort of a whiskey bottle. He drank until Martha's ghost faded from the corners of the room, and then he slept a sleep as deep and empty as a winter grave. He awoke not to the familiar ache of solitude, but to a scent that unmoored him from his grief. Coffee, rich and dark, a smell he hadn't known in his own home for 2 long years. He followed it to the kitchen, a space that had been Martha's heart and which he had allowed to grow cold and still. There Agnes moved before the cast-iron stove. In the morning light, her sighs, which had been the subject of such cruel amusement in the saloon, seemed to vanish in the quiet competence of her movements. She was not clumsy or slow, but measured and efficient, her hands broad and capable, kneading dough on a floured board with a practiced rhythm. She had already swept the floor, wiped the grime from the window panes, and coaxed a steady, warm flame from the hearth. The room felt alive. She did not look at him as he stood framed in the doorway, a specter in his own house. She simply poured a cup of coffee from the pot and set it on the table, a silent offering. He hesitated, then sat. He drank it. It was strong and hot, and it burned away some of the frost that had settled deep in his bones. He watched her slide a loaf of bread into the oven, her movements economical and graceful. She was transforming the space, breathing life back into the dead heart of his home. And she was doing it without permission, without a single word. It was an invasion, a gentle and terrifying conquest of his sorrow. He felt a wall within him, meticulously built, from loss and anger, begin to show the faintest of cracks. The feeling was so foreign, so unwelcome, that he stood abruptly and fled the warmth of the kitchen, seeking the familiar cold of the open range. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Agnes rose before the sun, and the house would wake with her. The scent of coffee and baking bread became the new constant, displacing the stale air of grief. She mended the curtains, patched Caleb's worn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, and scrubbed the floors until the pine boards gleamed. She never asked for anything, never offered a word more than necessary. But her actions spoke a language of restoration that Caleb could not ignore. His daughter was a whisper. Lily, a child of 6, had faded into the background of his life after her mother's passing. Her laughter had been buried with Martha, her voice shrinking until it was lost entirely in the vast, echoing silence of the house. She moved like a phantom, her small, pale face a constant, heartbreaking reminder of all he had lost. She watched Agnes from the shadows, a tiny, weary creature observing an unknown beast. Her eyes, wide and solemn, followed the woman's every move. Agnes, for her part, seemed not to notice, or perhaps she understood the language of wounded things. She did not try to speak to the girl, did not offer a false smile or a cooing word. She simply existed, a large, calming presence in the chaotic silence. She would leave a small, warm biscuit on the table, where she knew Lily would find it. She mended a tear in the child's worn dress and left it folded on her bed. These were offerings left at the edge of a clearing, invitations that asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, as the low sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor, Agnes was humming a low, tuneless sound, like the drone of a bee in summer clover. Lily crept from the shadows and stood in the doorway. Agnes did not turn. She simply sliced a piece of apple, crisp and white, and placed it on the edge of the wooden table. Then she went back to her work. For a long time, the slice of apple sat untouched. Caleb watched from the window, his breath held tight in his chest. Then, a small hand, thin as a bird's claw, darted out and snatched the offering. It was a beginning. A fragile bridge built in the quiet space between a broken child and a discarded woman. For the first time in 2 years, Caleb felt a pang of something that was not grief, but a tentative, terrifying flicker of hope. He turned away from the window, his own heart a battlefield. The calm was shattered a week later. Caleb was out mending a fence line at the far end of his property when he saw them 2 riders cresting the ridge, heading not for the house, but for the creek that fed his well. He recognized them instantly as Finch's men. One was Silas, a burly, bearded man with a reputation for casual brutality. The other was younger, slighter, a man named Jesse, who always looked like he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Caleb spurred his horse, his hand dropping to the colt at his hip. But they weren't there for a fight. He watched from a distance as Silas dismounted, unslung a heavy canvas sack from his saddle, and emptied its contents into the creek upstream from his well. He couldn't see what it was, but he didn't need to. It was a message. By the time Caleb galloped back to the house, they were gone. Agnes was standing by the well, a bucket in her hand, her face grim. She had seen them too. "The water is foul," she said, her voice flat. "It smells of rot." Rage, clean and hot, surged through Caleb, burning away the last vestiges of his apathy. Agnes's prophecy had come true. This was Finch's opening move, a slow poison meant to choke them out. This was the first obstacle. He looked from the poisoned well to the house where his daughter was, a house that now felt like a home again. And he knew he could no longer stand by and watch it all turn to ash. "Watch, Lily," he said, his voice hard as iron. "I'm riding into town." He was going to see the law. He was going to confront Sheriff Brody. He was going to make someone listen. The storm cloud was finally ready to break. The sheriff's office in Redemption smelled of stale coffee-oiled leather and resignation. Sheriff Brody sat behind a large, cluttered desk, his face a roadmap of weary compromise. He was an aging lawman, his shoulders slumped not by the weight of his years, but by the weight of all the things he chose not to see. He listened to Caleb's story, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression carefully neutral. "You saw Silas and Jesse pour something in the creek?" Brody asked, his voice tired. "I saw them. The well is poisoned, Brody. It's a clear attempt to run me off my land." Brody sighed a long, rattling sound. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Caleb, listen to me. Finch owns the water rights to half this valley. Legally, he can do what he pleases with that creek. You can't prove he was aiming for your well. This isn't about legalities, it's about what's right." Caleb slammed his hand on the desk, rattling a tin cup full of pens. "He sent his dogs to my ranch to threaten my family." "And what family is that?" Brody countered, his eyes flicking toward the window. "A child you barely look at, and a woman you won in a card game. Finch is a powerful man. He has friends. All you have is a failing ranch and a whole lot of bad luck. Take his offer. Sell the land. Move on. It's the smart play." The dismissal was absolute. Caleb looked at the man he had once respected and saw only a hollow shell. Brody wasn't the law. He was Finch's gatekeeper. Caleb stood up the chair, scraping harshly against the floorboards. "Thanks for the advice, Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. He was alone. He walked out into the dusty street, the afternoon sun beating down on him. His next stop was the last bastion of decency in Redemption, Eleanor's Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the familiar scent of cinnamon canvas and dried beans washing over him. Eleanor was behind the counter, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Caleb," she said, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "It's good to see you. You look better, less haunted." "Don't feel it," he grumbled, leaning against the counter. He told her everything: the poker game, Agnes's warning, the poisoned well, Brody's cowardly advice. Eleanor listened patiently, her brow furrowed. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. "Elias Finch has an obsession with your property, Caleb. It goes beyond business. He's been buying up debts all around here, but your place, he talks about it differently, like it's personal." She wiped down the counter with a damp cloth, her movements thoughtful. "It was Martha's family land, wasn't it?" "Her father homesteaded it," Caleb confirmed. Eleanor nodded. "Wait here." She disappeared into the back room and returned a moment later with a small, sepia-toned photograph in a worn wooden frame. She slid it across the counter. It was a picture of two young women, their arms linked, smiling brightly at the camera. One was a younger, vibrant Martha. The other was a stranger to Caleb. "That's me and Martha," Eleanor said softly. "Taken the summer before you two were married." She tapped a finger on the edge of the frame, where another figure could be seen in the background, partially obscured. a young woman with dark hair looking off to the side. "And that," she said, her voice low, "is Alara Finch." Caleb stared. Finch's sister. He knew Finch had a sister, but she had left town years ago. No one spoke of her. She and Martha were inseparable as girls, Eleanor explained. Best friends. Alara was nothing like her brother. She was gentle kind. She hated the way Elias treated people. She was supposed to be Martha's maid of honor, but she disappeared. Left town right before the wedding. No one ever heard from her again. A piece of a puzzle he didn't know existed had just been dropped in his lap. Finch's obsessive interest in Martha's land suddenly felt colder, more sinister. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his mind racing. He rode home with a new urgency. When he arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The lamplight from the kitchen window was a warm, welcoming beacon. He walked inside to a scene that stopped him in his tracks. Agnes was sitting at the table, a bowl of herbs in her lap, patiently showing Lily how to strip the leaves from the stems. The air was filled with the clean, sharp scent of mint and lavender. "And this one is for calming a fever," Agnes was saying in her low, steady voice. "Calming." Lily repeated, her small voice, a fragile, wondrous sound. It was more than a single word. It was a sentence, an interaction, a conversation. The child who had been lost in silence was re-emerging, drawn out by this patient, quiet woman. Lily looked up and saw her father standing in the doorway. She didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, a small, tentative smile touched her lips. A powerful emotion seized Caleb, something fierce and protective. This was what Finch wanted to destroy. This fragile, nascent peace. This new family being forged in the ruins of the old one. Later that night, after Agnes and Lily were asleep, Caleb lit a lamp and went to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed. Martha's chest. He hadn't opened it since she died. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender and old memories rose to meet him. Inside were her wedding dress, a collection of seashells, her favorite book of poetry. And at the very bottom, tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a bundle of letters. He carefully untied the ribbon. The handwriting was elegant looping. He read the first line, "My dearest Martha." The signature at the bottom was clear, "Yours always, Alara." He sat on the floor, the letters spread around him, and began to read. He read of a deep friendship between two young women. He read of Alara's growing fear of her brother's cold ambition and cruel nature. And then, in a letter dated just a few weeks before his own wedding to Martha, he found it. A line that made the hair on his arms stand up. "I cannot bear to be in his house another day, Martha. I've told Elias I am leaving, and he flew into a terrible rage. He forbids it. But my mind is made up. I will pack my things and meet you for our trip to the falls next week as planned. The wagon is ready. We will have a wonderful adventure, just the two of us, before you are a married woman." A trip to the falls, a wagon trip, the trip Martha had been on when the axle broke, the trip from which she had never returned, but she hadn't been alone. The winter came on fast and mean a bitter wind sweeping down from the mountains carrying the promise of snow. With it came the fever. It moved through the sparse homesteads of the valley like a phantom thief stealing the breath from the young and the old. When Lily coughed a dry rattling sound that echoed too closely, the cough Caleb could never forget, a cold serpent of dread coiled in his gut. By nightfall she was burning. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and fast. Panic, cold, and absolute seized Caleb. He was frozen in time, reliving the helpless horror of watching his wife slip away. The doctor was in Redemption, a full day's ride, and the sky was already a bruised, heavy gray, spitting the first hard pellets of snow. He was paralyzed, a storm cloud, incapable of anything but raining down his own fear. It was Agnes who moved. She touched Lily's forehead with a hand that was surprisingly cool and steady. "Get more wood for the fire," she said, her voice cutting through his panic. "And bring me snow, a clean bucket of it." Her command was so direct, so certain, that he obeyed without thought. While he was gone, she stripped the child of her sweat-soaked nightgown and began to bathe her forehead and limbs with cool water. She sent him to the pantry for the herbs she had harvested and dried willow bark and yarrow. She brewed a bitter tea, forcing it gently between Lily's cracked lips. The blizzard hit with the force of a physical blow, screaming around the corners of the small house, piling drifts against the doors and windows. They were trapped an island in a sea of white. For 2 days and 2 nights, Agnes did not leave the child's side. She was a mountain of resolve, her large body a shield against the fever. She held Lily, she bathed her, she spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, her presence a constant, unwavering vigil. Caleb could only watch a useless, terrified ghost as this woman he had won as a joke fought for his daughter's life with a strength he had never known. In the long, suffocating hours of the blizzard, with the wind howling its mournful song and the life of his child hanging by a thread, the walls between Caleb and Agnes finally crumbled into dust. They sat on either side of Lily's small bed, the flickering lamplight carving their faces from the darkness. "She looks like her." Caleb said, his voice a raw whisper. He didn't have to say the name. Martha's presence was a constant ghost in the room. The fever, it was the same. He spoke of his wife then, of the way she had laughed, of the plans they had made, of the utter helplessness he had felt as he watched her die. Then, his voice cracking, he told her about the accident. "We were on our way back from the falls," he choked out. "The wagon, the axle just snapped on the downgrade. It rolled. I was thrown clear. She was trapped underneath. The doctor said if I'd gotten her to him sooner." The guilt was a physical thing, a weight that had been crushing him for 2 years. "They said it was my fault, my recklessness." Agnes listened, her gaze never leaving his, her expression one of profound empathy. When his raw confession trailed off into exhausted silence, she finally spoke, her own voice low and heavy. "I knew Alara," she said softly. Caleb looked up, startled. "Before my father lost everything, before Finch, before all this." She explained, "My family worked for hers. I was a kitchen girl in their house. Alara was always kind to me. She was not like her brother." Agnes took a deep, shuddering breath, and the truth she had been holding back finally came out, reshaping the world around them. "The wagon accident that killed your wife, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her twilight eyes locking onto his. "It also killed Alara." The air left Caleb's lungs. What, no? They found only Martha. Alara left town. That is the story Elias told. Agnes countered, her voice firm. "But it is a lie. Alara was in that wagon with Martha. I know because she told me she was going. She was running away from her brother, and Martha was helping her. When Elias found out about the accident, he rode out there himself before the sheriff. He found his sister's body, and he buried it himself out in the Badlands. He told everyone she had simply run away as planned. He couldn't stand the shame of people knowing she died, trying to escape him." Caleb stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to fit the pieces together. Alara's letters, her fear of her brother, the secret wagon trip. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He blames you." Agnes finished her words, landing like hammer blows. "He has always blamed your supposed recklessness for his sister's death. He doesn't want this land for its value. He wants it because it was Martha's. He wants to tear down your life piece by piece until you have nothing left. Winning me in that card game, that was just the first cruel step in his plan to break you. He sent me here to watch you fall." The blizzard raged outside, but the true storm was in the small lamplit room. The narrative of Caleb's life had been a lie. He was not just a grieving widower, a victim of tragic misfortune. He was the focus of a deep, twisted, and patient vendetta. And the woman sitting across from him, the woman who was at that very moment saving his daughter's life, had been sent as its instrument. The blizzard broke on the third morning. The wind died, leaving behind a world of stunning silent white. In the stillness, Lily's fever broke as well. The heat receded from her skin, her breathing deepened, and she fell into a true healing sleep. The relief that washed over Caleb was so immense, it almost brought him to his knees. He was a changed man. The grief that had defined him was still there, a scar on his soul, but it was no longer the whole of him. It had been joined by a cold, clear purpose. He was no longer just a defender. He was a man seeking the truth. He looked at Agnes, who was slumped in her chair asleep from exhaustion, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it was humbling. She had been sent to destroy him, but she had saved him instead. He knew he could not beat Finch with a gun. Finch owned the law, he owned the town. A gunfight would only make Caleb a dead man and Lily an orphan. He had to beat him with the past. His new obstacle was no longer survival, but proof. He had to prove his innocence. He returned to the bundle of Alara's letters, his hands steady now, his mind sharp. He reread them not as a grieving husband, but as an investigator. He pored over every word, every phrase, searching for a detail he might have missed. And then he found it in the last letter, a casual postscript he had skimmed over in his initial grief-stricken reading. Bide P.S. The wagon should be sound as $1. That new blacksmith in town, Mr. Hobbs, just put a brand new pin in the front axle. He seems a decent man, though he looks perpetually worried. I suspect he owes my brother money like everyone else. Hobbs, the blacksmith. A decent man who looked perpetually worried. A man in Finch's debt. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He saddled his horse, the crisp, cold air biting at his face. He checked on Lily, sleeping peacefully under Agnes's watchful eye. He met Agnes's gaze over the sleeping child. No words were needed. She understood. He rode for redemption not with the desperate anger of a victim, but with the focused resolve of a hunter. The blacksmith shop was at the edge of town, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, a lonely sound in the snow-hushed morning. Caleb found Hobbs by his forge, his face slick with sweat despite the cold, his eyes darting nervously. He was a small, stooped man, his shoulders permanently hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Caleb didn't waste time with pleasantries. He strode up to the anvil, his presence blocking the light from the forge. Hobbs, we need to talk. About a wagon axle you repaired 2 years ago. For Martha Blackwood. The blacksmith froze the hammer, hovering in midair. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty gray. I don't recall. He stammered, his eyes refusing to meet Caleb's. I think you do. Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. I have a letter from Alara Finch mentioning the repair. A brand new pin, she said. At the mention of Alara's name, a tremor went through the blacksmith. The heavy hammer slipped from his grasp and clattered to the dirt floor. The weight on his shoulders seemed to double, buoying him over his anvil. He made me do it. Hobbs whispered the words, choked with a guilt 2 years in the making. Finch, he came to me. He knew I owed him. He said he wanted to teach you a lesson. Scare you off. He said you were getting too close to Martha, that you weren't good enough for his sister's friend. Caleb stood motionless as the whole ugly truth unspooled. He told me to weaken the pin. Hobbs confessed, tears now streaming down his soot-stained cheeks. To file it down so it would snap on a hard bump. Just a minor accident, he said. No one was supposed to get hurt. He just wanted to frighten you, to make you seem reckless, to drive a wedge between you and Martha before the wedding. He never intended. He never knew his own sister would be in that wagon. When he found out they had both died, he was a madman. He threatened to ruin me, to kill me if I ever spoke a word of it. The confession hung in the air, thick with the smell of coal smoke and old sorrow. It wasn't just a vendetta born of grief. It was a cover-up. Finch's cruelty had set the tragedy in motion, and his pride had buried the truth along with his sister. Caleb finally had his proof. It wasn't written on paper, but it was etched in the face of a guilt-racked man. Now he just had to find a way to use it. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and a low, angry wind was kicking up dust from the plains, whipping it into stinging clouds. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, a physical manifestation of the conflict that was about to descend on the ranch. Inside the small house, the air was electric with tension. A mantel clock, repaired and polished by Agnes, ticked loudly, each second a beat in a drum roll, counting down to the inevitable. They arrived just before dusk. Not 2 men this time, but 4. Finch, astride a sleek black stallion, sat at their head. Beside him were Silas and Jesse, and lagging a few paces behind his face, a mask of grim reluctance, was Sheriff Brody. Finch had brought the law with him. Caleb stood on the porch, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him, within easy reach, but not in his hands. Agnes stood in the doorway, a silent pillar of strength, with Lily holding tight to her skirt. Finch dismounted, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He strode toward the porch, his cruel smile firmly in place. Blackwood, the time for games is over. This is a deed to your land, legally signed over to me to clear your debts. Sheriff Brody is here to see the transfer is peaceful. That deed is a fraud, Caleb said calmly. Perhaps, Finch conceded with a shrug. But the sheriff believes it's real, and he also believes the sworn testimony of 2 men who will say they saw you rustling my cattle. You have 2 choices. Sign over this worthless patch of dirt and I'll let you ride away. Refuse and Sheriff Brody will arrest you. Your daughter. He added, his voice laced with venom as he glanced at Lily. Will become a ward of the county. I wonder who will adopt a rustler's child. The stakes were laid bare. His land, his freedom, his daughter. Finch had him cornered. But Caleb didn't look cornered. He looked resolute. He didn't reach for his rifle. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Finch. It wasn't a cattle raid you were planning, was it, Finch? It was a prank. A cruel little prank that went wrong. Finch's smile faltered. I don't know what you're talking about. You paid Hobbs to sabotage the wagon. Caleb said, his voice clear and ringing in the charged air. You just wanted to cause a small accident, to scare me, to make me look reckless in front of Martha. But you didn't know your sister was going to be in that wagon, did you? Finch went pale. That's a lie. Hobbs is a drunk and a liar. He snarled, his composure shattering. He looked to his men for support. Silas looked impassive, but Jesse, the younger, more reluctant of the two, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. His gaze dropped to the ground. You buried your own sister in an unmarked grave to cover up your crime. Caleb pressed on his voice, rising with righteous fury. You let me live with the guilt for 2 years. You've twisted your grief into a weapon to destroy my life, all to hide the fact that you killed her. He's lying. Finch screamed, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his belt. Brody, arrest him. Sheriff Brody hesitated, his eyes wide, looking from Finch's rabid face to Caleb's steady one. For the first time, he seemed to be weighing the truth, not just the power. It was then that Agnes stepped forward from the doorway, her presence commanding the scene. The wind whipped her dark dress around her, making her seem larger than life. In her outstretched hand, she held a small object that glinted in the dying light. A silver locket, tarnished and delicate. But it wasn't Martha's. Alara gave this to me, Agnes said, her voice cutting through the wind. The day before she left. She asked me to keep it for her. She was afraid of you, Elias. She wrote to me. She told me of your rages, of your possessiveness. She told me you threatened her when she said she was leaving. Agnes held Finch's gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen. She knew you were capable of anything. Finch stared at the locket, his sister's locket, the one he had given her for her 16th birthday. It was the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. The truth was out naked and damning in the swirling dust. From his horse, Jesse spoke, his voice cracking. It's true. I heard him in the saloon one night, drunk, bragging to Silas about how he'd fixed Blackwood's wagon. He called it a bit of harmless fun. The confession, so simple and direct, shattered Finch's world. His righteous facade, built on 2 years of lies and cultivated hatred, crumbled into dust. He was not the avenger. He was the killer. A defeated, guttural roar of pure rage erupted from his throat. He drew his gun, a wild, cornered animal looking for an escape. He aimed it not at Caleb, but at Jesse the traitor. But before he could fire, a figure moved with surprising speed. Sheriff Brody stepped directly in front of Finch's gun, his own pistol drawn and steady. It's over, Elias. Brody said, his voice filled with the authority he had abdicated for so long. Finch stood there, his gun aimed at the sheriff's chest, his face a contorted mask of hate and despair. For a moment it seemed he would fire. Then the strength went out of him. His shoulders slumped. The gun fell from his numb fingers into the dust. He was a man broken not by a bullet, but by the unbearable weight of his own lies. As if on cue, the sandstorm broke. The wind died down, and the first fat drops of a cleansing rain began to fall, turning the dust to dark, clean mud. Sheriff Brody, a man rediscovering his own spine, holstered his weapon and moved to cuff a catatonic Elias Finch. I'm sorry, Caleb. Brody said, his voice heavy with shame. I let this town down. I let you down. I'll see that justice is done. Jesse dismounted, his face pale but resolute. I'll testify, he said, looking at Caleb. I'll tell them everything I heard. Brody nodded, then loaded Finch onto his horse. With a final look of apology, he and Silas rode off, leading their prisoner back toward redemption, leaving Jesse to follow on his own. On the porch, Caleb, Agnes, and Lily stood together, watching them go. The rain fell harder now, washing away the grit and grime, not just from the land, but from their lives. There was no grand celebration, only a quiet, exhausted peace. The war was over. Caleb turned and looked at Agnes. He truly saw her not as the prize he'd won, not as the cook, not even as the savior of his child, but as the partner who had stood with him and saved them all. He saw the intelligence in her calm eyes, the resilience in the set of her jaw, the deep well of kindness she had shown his daughter. He realized with a start that he didn't even know her full name. He had just called her Agnes the name Finch had used a name for property. Agnes. He began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. What is your full name? She looked surprised by the simple question. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. Agnes Hobbs, she said softly. Caleb's eyes widened in stunned realization. Hobbs, the blacksmith. He thought of the man's perpetual worry, his deep-seated guilt. She was his daughter, the daughter he had been forced to sell into indenture to pay a debt to the very man who had coerced him into a crime. The layers of Finch's cruelty were deeper than he had ever imagined. Seeing her as a whole person had revealed a final painful truth, cementing the bond between them with a shared understanding of all they had overcome. A month later, the world was green. The rains had come, and the parched land had responded with a burst of life. The ranch was clean and orderly. Green shoots of corn and beans poked through the dark soil in the garden Agnes had so patiently cultivated. The sagging porch had been repaired, and the house had a fresh coat of whitewash, and the windows sparkled in the spring sun. Caleb was repairing a fence at the edge of the property, but his movements were different now. They were not the frantic, distracting motions of a man running from his thoughts, but the steady, purposeful work of a man building a future. He finished his work and walked not to the house, but up the small hill. Fresh wildflowers, blue and yellow, sat in a jar at the base of Martha's cross. Agnes had put them there. He knelt and placed his hand on the weathered wood of the headstone. He didn't speak. He just stayed there for a long moment, a silent goodbye, a final letting go of the grief that had been his only companion for so long. Then he stood, turned his back on the grave, and walked toward the living. He found them on the porch. Agnes was sitting in the rocking chair, and Lily stood before her, her back to Caleb. Agnes's large, capable hands were moving through Lily's fine hair, patiently teaching the child how to braid it. The scene was so simple, so peaceful. It filled a space in his heart he thought would forever be empty. As he approached, Lily must have sensed his presence. She turned her face bright and animated. She looked up at him, and for the first time since her mother's death, her face broke into a wide, genuine, unclouded smile. A sound bubbled up from her chest, clear and pure as a mountain spring, a clear, happy laugh. The sound was the story's final emotional resolution. It was the sound of healing, the sound of hope, the sound of a home reborn. Caleb walked up the steps and stood before them. He reached down and took Agnes's hand. He didn't need to say anything. Their shared look conveyed everything: a question, an answer, and a promise of a future built together, not on the ashes of the past, but on the new green growth of the present. The three of them stood as a new family, a constellation formed from broken pieces, finally at peace under the vast open sky.